Today we're going to take a look at the 1980s in church history and some associated events associated with that decade. For many people in the United States, the late 1970s were a troubled and troubling time. The radical and countercultural movements of the 1960s and early 1970s, the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, uncertainty in the Middle East, and economic crisis at home had undermined Americans' confidence in their fellow citizens and in their government. By the end of the Jimmy Carter presidency, the idealistic dreams of the 1960s were worn down by inflation, foreign policy turmoil, and rising crime. In response, many Americans embraced a new conservatism in social, economic, and political life during the 1980s. And the decade saw the rise also of the young urban professionals, known as yuppies, who were less interested in saving the world and more interested in making money and living the good life. The decade started with the Winter Olympics at Lake Placid, New York. The United States hockey team, made up of amateur and collegiate players led by coach Herb Brooks, defeated the heavily favored Soviet team who had won nearly every world championship and Olympic tournament since 1964. When sportscaster Al Michaels asked at the end of the game, "Do you believe in miracles?" "Yes." It became forever known as the Miracle on Ice. The two Summer Olympics of the 1980s became embroiled in political controversy, as President Jimmy Carter ordered a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Games to protest the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union returned the favor by boycotting the 1984 LA Summer Games. In the 1980 presidential election, Republicans selected actor and former California Governor Ronald Reagan to run against Jimmy Carter. Carter, burdened by a continued weak economy and the Iran hostage crisis, which became to many a symbol of American impotence during the Carter years, lost decisively to Reagan. Reagan's presidency was nearly cut short by the bullet of a would-be assassin, John Hinckley Jr., as he was shot and seriously wounded as he was leaving a Washington hotel on March 30th, 1981. But Reagan recovered with his sense of humor intact as he said to the doctors who were about to operate on him, "I hope you're all Republicans." In domestic affairs, Reagan set out to revitalize the economy, reduce taxes, balance the federal budget, and reduce the size and scope of the federal government. In foreign affairs, he vowed to rebuild the American military and confront the Soviet Union and its allies with a new vigor and purpose. Soviet leaders resented Reagan's description of their country in a March 8, 1983 speech as the evil empire, but were preoccupied with their own leadership issues. In November of 1982, Leonid Brezhnev, who had led the Soviet Union since 1964, died. He was followed in quick succession by Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, both who were in poor health during their tenures in office. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union and pursued reforms in Russia and toward its allies in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev doctrine of having the Soviet Union intervene with military force if necessary to preserve communist rule in Eastern Europe. On June 12, 1987, President Reagan, visiting Berlin to celebrate its 750th anniversary, said in a speech on the Brandenburg Gate, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 29 months later, on the night of November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War division of Europe, came down. The collapse of the Berlin Wall was the culminating point of the revolutionary changes sweeping East Central Europe in 1989. Solidarity in Poland formed the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe since 1948. Soon, communist parties in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and East Europe, Germany, also ceded power. For all intents and purposes, the collapse of communism in East Central Europe marked the end of the Cold War. But in China, after millions of Chinese protested in Tiananmen Square calling for greater democracy and an end to corruption, Chinese troops stormed Tiananmen Square on June 4, 1989, killing many and arresting thousands. Science and technology made great strides in the 1980s. Large numbers of Americans began using personal computers in their homes, offices, and schools. The grouping of computer networks together became known as the Internet. And in 1989, Tim Berners-Lee invented a network-based implementation of the hypertext concept, which he called the World Wide Web. Columbia, America's first reusable spacecraft, was launched in 1981, but it was a sad day in history when on January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 74 seconds after liftoff, killing all 7 aboard, including school teacher Krista McAuliffe. Other firsts of the 1980s included camcorders, fax machines, CDs and CD players, genetic fingerprinting or DNA profiling for obtaining evidence in a crime, Microsoft Windows, the first disposable contact lenses, laser eye surgery, the Hubble Space Telescope, and the U.S. stealth bomber. And Barney Clark lived 112 days after becoming the first person to receive an artificial heart. In pop culture, up to the 1980s, ABC, CBS, and NBC enjoyed a virtual monopoly in the television industry. In the 1980s, however, cable television began to experience unprecedented growth. At the end of the decade, 60% of American homes were wired for cable, and many new networks were available on cable, including ESPN, MTV, CNN, and the Weather Channel. Also in the 80s, many flocked to video arcades to play the latest games like Centipede, Galaga, Frogger, Donkey Kong, and the biggest one of all, Pac-Man. So many people had Pac-Man fever. Other fads of the 1980s included Cabbage Patch Dolls, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Jazzercise, Trivial Pursuit, the TV show American Gladiators, and Valley Girl Speak, which was like totally awesome. Here in Rittman, a large crowd attended the dedication of the new AmeriCare Rittman Healthcare Center. The ribbon cutting was held in the dining room of the 100-bed nursing home on East Sunset. Accepting a plaque for the city was city manager Maxine Oglesby, along with Councilman John Francis, Denny Franks, Don Hoagland, and Robert Stewart. Rittmanites have always supported their Rittman Indians, and it was no different in the 80s. People were excited about the 1980-81 Rittman freshman basketball team, who followed up undefeated seasons in 7th and 8th grade, with winning the Wayne County League freshman tournament with a 15-0 record under first-year head coach Howard Morris. The Rittman Indians football team was out to defend the 1980 co-championship under first-year head coach Mike Schmitz. And the 1981 Rittman girls volleyball team won its 5th Wayne County League title in a row with an 11-1 record, 1 game better than Smithville. In 1983, here in the church, Pastor Russell resigned, and the church called Bud and Ann Oshevsky to Rittman. In 1984, a new roof was installed on the building and was completed and paid for in just a few months. In 1985, Pastor Bud challenged the congregation in the area of additional staffing to help in the area of youth and evangelism. And Pastor Mike Prenovich was then called as associate pastor October 9, 1985. In addition to reducing the debt from the 1979 edition, Pastor Bud and Pastor Mike helped the church focus on the supreme importance of reaching Rittman for Jesus Christ. And that's the 1980s.